Well, it is kind of amazing if you think about all these problems that we have, this outrageous unemployment, potential extinction of the human species in a 62 million year extinction cycle, the lack of infrastructure development that we've had for decades and decades, the collapsing state of the infrastructure, our lack of really educating young people, creating in each new generation a scientific cadre, an intellectual cadre, all those problems, and one project could address everything. That's really amazing how big how much that project encompasses. But the biggest, there's a lot of immediate relief that's needed. Employment, getting these satellites going to start looking at these precursors, since we do understand at least a little bit about the extreme weather conditions that are approaching for the next however many several years. But the long term, what NAWAPA intends for the long term is really the hardest to grasp, maybe, or maybe the least to be discussed. But taking resources and managing them on a continent-wide scale has just never been done before. But that's really, where Vernadsky envisions mankind taking science and taking industry, human labor and scientific thought. He says that that's what it is. It's a geological force. And there's a real perversion of Vernadsky with his idea of the noosphere, right? The mind, cognition, the realm of human knowledge, and then the physical effect that has, that human beings have because of that unique power of ours. Well, because a lot of his stuff just simply isn't translated into English yet. So a lot of these kooky, environmentalists will take his notion of, he has the biosphere, right, the realm of life, which they get really excited about. But when it comes to the noosphere and humanity's role in that, they're able to really pervert it. And they say that human beings, we're unique in that we have a mind so that we can be conscious of the terrible effects we're having on the biosphere. And we can choose to, prevent ourselves from having terrible effects and messing with nature. That is not Vernadsky's outlook on it at all. He's much more optimistic, and it's actually incredibly inspiring. So we're going to look a little bit at him, but more so at what happens when human beings fail to act as the noosphere and attempt to act as a biological process. So we're going to use Shakespeare to help us with that. And specifically looking at the British monarchy, which is a biological process. So if anybody wants to know what's wrong with Prince Charles, his parents are cousins in 2 different ways. So it might explain some things. But the British monarchy, William Shakespeare takes this up, where it's not law or merit or a principle, that governs society, but blood, the purest blood and heredity. And then somehow the principle of that is, there's some magical, religious, superstitious, godly power, somehow resides in the firstborn son of some pure bloodline, So what he, let's see. Look at Will. Talking about him. So he does this history of the British kings, what are called his history plays. He only actually covers 7 kings. Yes. Although there are several plays, because there are some moments that are so hectic, there's no way he could handle it in just one play. Like Henry VI has 3 parts, all 5-act plays, because that time we'll get into it. We'll look at it. It gets crazy. But anyway, so let me find King John. This is where Shakespeare starts. His history is with King John. Now, the modern history, I guess, of the British monarchy, I think most people start back with the Norman conquest, right, in 1066. So you had, and ever since then, so Normandy, right, from France, you had these French guys come in and conquer England. So ever since then, there's been this thing which recurs over and over and over again in Shakespeare's plays about England and France, and whether or not you're the king of one or both of them or whatever. So anyway, so the first William, it eventually comes down, right, this guy was king, then this guy, then his son was king, and then his son, and so forth. And so we end up with King John. Well, actually, his brother Richard was king. Yeah, the Plantagenet line started with Henry II. This was like in the mid-1100s. So Henry II had 2 sons, Richard and then John, this John. And so Richard dies, and rather than naming his son, all this gets taken up in the play, right? That the son, Richard's son, does not become king, but his brother. Obviously there's going to be some problems there. So King John is the king, thus his name King John. And so Arthur is the son of Richard, but he's like 12 years old, he's a kid. So of course his mother is on this constant, crusade to make her son the king, that John shouldn't be the king. So she goes down to France and gets a faction in France, the king of France, to support her and her son's claim to the English throne. And so they're going to have a war.
What else?
And so they meet in Algiers. I guess they're in France. Or they're in Algiers. Or that's the name of the town in the play. I don't think it's like Africa or anything like that. But so they're in Europe, in whatever town. So they're going to fight. And then, at the beginning of the play, Richard had a bastard son who comes in the first scene. And although some other guy had claimed that his wife was true and so had said the son was his, although it couldn't have been possible, and the mom eventually admits that she had slept with Richard. So the guy's kind of happy about that, because that means his dad was a king. So that also kind of creates some problems, because here is actually the first real born son of a king, only it was out of wedlock. So there's all these factors, right? Because everything's based on this silly notion of bloodline. So they're outside the gates of this town, and so the bastard, his name's Bastard in the play, he actually has a different name. He's called Robert or Philip or something like that. Everyone also has 3 different names, in the oligarchy and the aristocracy. Their name might be something like Bob, but then when they get knighted, they'll become John. And then you can refer to them as either, or you can refer to him as his title. You can either call him Bob or John, or Duke of whatever. So it all gets really silly. Anyways, so they're outside this town, and there's going to be this big fight between England and France, and who's going to become the king of England. And so the bastard guy steps up, and he's like, look, why don't you guys unite together, because Algiers refuses to side with either one. They're like, look, we will support the true king of England, but we don't know which one it is. So then Bastard steps up and he's like, look, England, look, France, why don't you guys just unite together against Algiers? And then after you've conquered them, then you can kind of work your stuff out. You can work out your differences. So they agree to that. But then the people of Algiers are like, whoa, we have a different suggestion. And then they suggest that the niece or whatever of the King of England marries the son of the King of France. And so that will create, a political union and end their fighting. And so they agree that that's probably a better solution. So they agree to that. The kids are okay with it. So they get married. And then now someone has to go tell the mother of Arthur that France has basically abandoned her cause and is now in a political union with England. So she hears that, of course, she's totally upset. And then the church shows up because apparently England was refusing to seat, the cardinal or whatever position, right, for Canterbury.
Archbishop.
The archbishop, okay. So he was refusing to seat the archbishop and basically, let the church dictate policy to England. So then this representative of the church, a very high official, shows up right after the wedding, right after they've created this political union, and tells the King of England to ask for forgiveness or be excommunicated. And so he's like, screw you. I'm king, and you're not going to, from Rome, from over there in Italy, you're not going to dictate to us our policy. So he excommunicates him. So now what is France going to do? Are they going to be heathens in this political alliance with England, or are they going to, not get the curses of the church and remain loyal to the church? So of course they choose the church over England. So now this fragile new political alliance is totally destroyed. And then this church official, when he starts talking, he has this little private conference with the Louis, who's the Dauphin, he's the crown prince of France, about how he has, because all this is incestuous, so his bloodline has just as much claim to the English throne as John or Arthur or John's son. So he could be king of England. So then that gets his fantasy land going. And so then they're recommitted to a war, right, with England, and he wants to win and become the king of England, none of which works. And they just slaughter each other, and in the end, John dies, and his son, who's also like a 15-year-old kid, is named the next king. So nothing, gets resolved. There's still all these factions, and so then a few more kings go by. There's all these Edwards until the next play that Shakespeare writes, which is Richard II. And there's a lot of reference to these Edwards, but it's the same thing all over again. Like, so many people have claims to the throne. The king has killed most of the people that could kind of challenge him. But then that lets the factions against him, that gives them reason to hate him and want to kick him out of power because he's a bloody murderer who wants a bloody murderer for their king. You can't respect that. That's not holy. So you shouldn't be in that position. So that goes on and on and on for the next several plays and over the next couple hundred years. But after Richard II, because in the play, Shakespeare has them making all these references about how England is just totally destroyed now. But this is back in 1377, that England has totally lost any real principle, it's just been so destroyed by all this faction fighting, although it just continues. So once Richard is no good, he's maybe deposed, or maybe when he dies, then a new line of royal family takes over. So it's no longer the Plantagenets, but now the Lancasters. And so that's Henry IV, and there's just all this faction fighting. So that is what just dominates his reign, and everybody's killing everybody. And then, so his son Henry V, which is that's a really famous play. So Henry V, and in Henry IV, you get a good idea of who Henry V is, because in Henry IV, his son Henry V is just this gallivanting drunkard kid, right? Just this spoiled brat who's just running around bar hopping, womanizing, hanging out with like just these degenerates like Falstaff and stuff like that. Who's a character in Merry Wives of Windsor, who's just trying to woo all these different widows. It's such a hilarious cast. Anyway, but that kid is supposed to be the next king. And so in Henry V, at the end of Henry IV, he advises his son that the way to avoid civil war and civil unrest, which is what he's had to deal with his whole career as king, is to start foreign wars. So get everyone united at home against some common enemy. So that's what Henry V does. And he starts this war. Oh, there's some Henrys. Here's Henry V. Young guy. Here's Henry IV. I don't know what he's got on his head. So there's Henry V. So he actually leads a very successful campaign in France, where finally France is reconquered for England. So after King John had lost it, right after 100 and whatever years, now the kings of England have reclaimed France. But then he dies, as happens to all of us, and his son, Henry VI, is like a year old. But because he's the oldest son, he has to become king. So he's like this 1-year-old, if he's even a whole year old yet. So obviously there's a faction fight around who his protectors are going to be, who's really going to run the country. And so in this time period, during the reign of Henry VI, which goes on for decades, his whole life, that's where you have the War of the Roses. So the whole fight between the Lancasters and the Yorks. So it's just, rather than kissing cousins, they're just dueling cousins. So they're all killing each other. And under Henry VI, they lose France. So the son, right, lost what the father had gained, which also just fueled this whole hatred of him and all the factions and stuff like that, because all these people, once France was gained, then the aristocrats and the people who had helped fight in that war, they gained the titles and they gained the land and they gained all this stuff. And now they just lost it because of this brat, Henry VI. So they decide that line, I think he was deposed. Like they just said, you're stuck, you can't be king anymore. And so then the House of York takes over. So now it's gone from the Lancasters to the Yorks. Because everyone's just pissed at that poor kid. And then, so Henry VI, because of that War of the Roses and just all the intrigues and all the backstabbing, that he has to write 3. That's one that's 3 parts to Henry VI. And then, then it's just more chaos basically after that. There was another king. I'm not totally sure who decided who was going to be king next once Henry VI was kicked out. They named another king, the head of the York family or whatever. And so his son became king for like 77 days. So then that didn't work out too well. He sucked. And, what happens here, this is the fun part. This is Richard III. Everyone knows that evil hunchback who starts out the whole play with some of our discontent, winter of our discontent, how he was born and dogs barked at him and howls screeched and he's just ugly and he's not made for peacetime. He's not made for amorous evenings with women. He wants war. So that's what he's gonna get. So anyways, his brother was the first York, that after Henry VII, Edward V was the York king, and he died, natural causes. So his son became king, but again, he was very young, and so the dad, Edward V, named his brother, Richard III, to be the caretaker of his son. Isn't that sweet? So, oh, there's Richard III. Seem a little, the painter is nice to him compared to Shakespeare's description of him. So, but if you guys remember this play, because it's a little bit more famous, a little bit more known, he kills everyone, and everyone knows it, and everyone is too scared to stand up to him or do anything. But he actually only rules for a couple of years, and then at the end of Richard III, because there's this scene, you guys know, where there's this widow and she's bringing out the body of her dead husband, who everyone knows Richard III kills. He killed her husband, and she's right there in the presence of her dead husband's body, and then Richard III asks her to marry him, and she says yes. Like, that's how insane and degenerate and fearful, you know, this English monarchy has become. So, so then at the end of Richard III, Henry VII comes in, and he had been, you know, exiled. His family had ruled before. Then they were down in France. So he was raised in France, had some of these like ties to royal bloodline, so he could, and he was a really good guy. This is Henry VII, whom Lynn references a lot as coming into England and creating a modern nation state because of the inspiration, because of the fight that Joan of Arc waged. Oh, I think that's why Henry VI lost France. That was the time of Joan of Arc. So she rallied the people of France to kick the English out right after they had come in and conquered. Anyway, sorry. So in France, there was, because of Joan of Arc, there was just a rise of nationalism, the idea of your nation being for your people, not having like arbitrary outside powers just come in and take you over. So there was a blossoming, a beginning of a blossoming of a different idea of the principle of your nation. So Henry VII grew up in that environment, in that discussion of nationalism and statehood and stuff like that. So he goes, because Richard is such a brutal, insane tyrant, a monster, he comes in and obviously finds support for him to fight Richard III, kick him out. And so that happens at the very end of Richard III. They have this fight, and Richard III dies. Henry VII is king, and then Shakespeare doesn't write a Henry VII, but he does write a Henry VIII.
Oh, yes.
And so, because this is a biological process, no matter how great the father was, you know, there's not a guarantee in the blood that the son is going to be any good. So Henry VIII, being his oldest son, becomes king, and, you know, people know the story of him, although Shakespeare is pretty nice to Henry VIII, probably because he was living under Elizabeth, and he was probably going to get killed if he said anything truthful. Yeah, so then Henry VIII, right, beheads 6 or like 5 of his wives. I guess he had 6 of them. Maybe he only beheaded like 4.
4.
Yeah, okay. And then, well, even then, right, it just still goes on to today. Well, I guess the Tudor family, the Tudor line, right, ended with Elizabeth because she didn't have any kids. And so, because during her time period, this is the play by Schiller, Mary Stuart, where Elizabeth has Mary killed because there's this whole faction that could make a legitimate argument that, because Elizabeth, yeah, maybe her dad was king, but her mom was a whore.
Yep.
But then you had Mary, Queen of Scots, who had a much more pure, bloodline. Maybe it wasn't directly the Henry VIII, but she could definitely say she, could have challenged Elizabeth and did. And then there was this whole faction around it, and also it involved all the Catholic Protestant stuff. And
Henry VIII was the one that caused the Protestant stuff.
Yeah, which was
So
again Henry
somebody.
VII, his dad, intentionally married him because Henry VII came from France, conquered England. Obviously, there was a unity there, a political alignment, and then he married his son to Catherine of Aragon from Spain to just create a political union amongst these major powers and to stop all this war, stop all this crap, try to get something good going. And then that's why the Venetians sent Georgie to England to be the marriage counselor of Henry VIII. And obviously that whole plan was thrown out the window. He broke from the church, right? Or divorced Catherine and broke from the church. And so all the, political alliances that could have created peace in Europe were broken, and you just have religious war. Anyway, so this whole Catholic faction was behind Mary Stuart, and Elizabeth stuck with her dad's Church of England. Anyway, so she dies without having any kids. Oh my God, what's gonna happen? But then, so Mary Stuart's son, James, becomes the king. And so then you had James the First. So there was a Stuart line now, that's the family. And then that continues. Also, Elizabeth's sister, who reigned before her, was Bloody Mary. So that kind of tells you what the times were like. That was all the religious warfare stuff. So anyway, so then, it just goes into modern time. Eventually, the Stuart line turns into the Hanover line because Queen Anne also didn't have any kids, and the Electric Sophie from Hanover. And that's what Leibniz was involved in, educating Sophie and her daughter. Then Sophie died, so her son became King George the First, and then just the Hanoverian line became all the Georges. And eventually they changed their name to a more British-sounding word, Windsor, which is where the current monarchical family comes from. So none of that was happy, none of that was good, or even the moments that were good weren't based on a principle. It was based on, well, that guy came into power because he had a pure bloodline, some pure connection to some former king. And that's what happens. You get British monarchy when human beings try to act like biological processes. And Shakespeare really concludes all this stuff because about this time, the 1600s, this is when you have this movement to leave Europe, the Pilgrims and the original colonization of North America. So you have the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony. So this effort is being made at this time. And so Shakespeare is definitely giving this picture of what a total bloody mess this oligarchical principle is. And it's been hundreds of years of this. And that's it. It's hundreds of years of this over and over and over again. And that's all it is. And then he writes The Tempest, which I don't know if people outside of the LaRouche organization have made this argument, but that he's writing about America and creating a new society. Because he definitely could not have written that explicitly, but the argument could definitely be made that that's what he's talking about, a different power or principle of power and rule and relationships among people and stuff like that. So I just wanted to read a little bit from Vernadsky, what he has to say about what human beings really are. Let's see if I forgot to show you anything else. So this is his paper, Scientific Thought and Scientific Work as a Geological Force in the Biosphere. So there's a very small quote that was sent out in the announcement for the class, what the class was going to be on. I just really thought reading a couple paragraphs about this. Because now Vernadsky is living in the late 1800s, early half of the 20th century. He dies in 1945. And he's a Russian. So there are very few people that are more pessimistic than Russians. But Vernadsky is incredibly optimistic. So he's living in, time period of World War II, Bolshevik Revolution, after years and years of czars, which is the same bloody mess, and even before that, then you had all this, just crazy landed aristocracy, and they owned people, the serfs and stuff like that. So life was not very good for most Russian people for most of the time, which is true about all people all over the world. But in looking at what's really interesting about what was coming out at this time, about the breakthroughs in nuclear science, is actually being able to measure the age of rocks and things like that. So actually, for the first time, was it scientifically known that the Earth was billions of years old? That you had certain rocks and things like that, because of the chemical state that they were in, it had to have been that way for millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of years. So, so he's discussing in this paper these processes as they work in geological time. And he says that there are certain moments when these processes of the biosphere are accelerated. He doesn't really, I haven't read the whole thing yet because it's kind of long, I haven't read it yet, but he doesn't say, at least in this part that I have read, what specific times those are, but that's a really important point about the acceleration that time and all these processes, the development of the universe or the biosphere and life here on Earth, it's not linear, but it actually has a change in its time, and it accelerates. And then you can see why that's a really good argument for the role of man in the biosphere. So he says, I'm going to start this paragraph still recently. Is it big enough? Okay. Still recently, it's a funny translation. So geology was dominated by an idea that geologists cannot recognize the manifestations of slow geological changes that had taken place during the epoch of man's existence. Right? No one sees a process that takes 1 million years. You just do not live long enough to see it with your eyes. So, geology was dominated by that idea that you just can't recognize these long processes. He says, in the times of my youth, one learned and thought that as a rule, the climate, the mountain structures, the species of organisms do not change in the course of a geological study, are not current affairs for a geologist. Now, this ideological situation, essential for a naturalist, has changed abruptly, and we see the action of the surrounding geological forces more clearly and intensely. It is hardly an accident that this change coincided with the growth in scientific consciousness of the belief in the geological significance of Homo sapiens. With the discovery of a new biosphere state, noosphere, being one of the forms in which this state expresses itself. This discovery is certainly related to the growth of precision of the natural science research and thought within the limits of the biosphere where living matter plays the main role. So that's what Lynn is saying we're going to do with this whole NAWAPA project, is actually because you're saying that man has a role in these processes, in geological processes, you therefore redefine all these areas of science. And so he's saying with the discovery that man has this role, it's completely changed the definition of geology, the outlook of geologists. We're going to redefine these sciences because of the role of man. And then later, it's just this last, right there, and we're going to go to the top. The evolutionary process, he's been discussing evolution before here. So, the evolutionary process acquires a special geological significance because it has created a new geological force, the scientific thought of social humanity. Now we witness its manifest entering the geological history of our planet. During the recent millennia, one observes an intense growth of influence of the living matter of one species, civilized humanity, upon the shift of the biosphere condition. Under the action of scientific thought and human labor, the biosphere goes over to a new state, the noosphere. Due to regular movement, which lasted 1 to 2 millions of years, at a rate constantly accelerating in its manifestations, humanity embraces the whole planet and becomes separated, isolated, from the other living organisms as a new and unprecedented geological force. In this way, at a rate comparable to that of reproduction, which is expressed by a geometric progression with time, an incessantly growing set of new, for the biosphere, inert natural bodies and new great natural phenomena is created in the biosphere. Before our eyes, the biosphere changes sharply, and there can hardly be any doubt that its reconstruction, which is being manifested in this way by scientific thought through organized human labor, is not an occasional phenomenon depending upon the will of man, but an elementary natural process whose roots are deep and were prepared by an evolutionary process which has lasted for hundreds of millions of years. Can you see? When man is guided by a scientific and neither philosophical nor religious concept of the world, he ought to understand that he is not an incidental, independent from the surrounding world, the biosphere or the noosphere, freely acting natural phenomenon. He is an inevitable manifestation of a great natural process having lasted in a regular way for at least 2 billions of years. So this whole billions and billions of years, well, he says at least 2 billion as far as he knows so far, this whole development has led to the emergence of a new phenomenon that would have an even greater, more accelerating geological force, rate of change. At present, under the influence of the surrounding horrors of life, we often hear about the downfall of civilization, about the self-destruction of humanity, and that, along with an unprecedented blossoming of scientific thought. These attitudes and these judgments seem to be a consequence of an insufficiently deep penetration into the surrounding world. Scientific thought is not yet embodied in life. We live under the influence of philosophical and religious habits, still persisting, but irrelevant to the present-day realities. Scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge, manifesting itself as the geological force creating the noosphere, cannot lead to the results. So, got that? Scientific knowledge cannot lead to results contradicting the geological process that had created it. It is not an incidental phenomenon. It is very deeply rooted. So that's his idea of the emergence of the noosphere, which is interesting. He's saying that scientific thought is not yet embodied in life. Like, however awesome human beings have been so far, even at his point in time, which might have been the 20s, 30s, 40s, I'm not totally sure when this paper was written, like all the advancement, electricity, right, trains, medical breakthroughs, like vaccinations, all the stuff we've discovered yet is like, it's you can hardly even count that as existing yet in terms of like how much is out there and where all we can go, that it's hardly even begun. And so any pessimism, like when people want to look around them, saying at all these horrors of life, the destruction of whole civilizations, you're just not really looking at what's really going on in these longer term processes. But what everything's actually doing is leading to a higher development, with man playing now a new role in the development of the biosphere, which, you know, means the whole universe. Yeah.
Is scientific thought really embodied in human life now? Would it be more? Well, I assume it would be more than at that time, but still there are many people that are deeply religious, those of the Jewish faith that go to synagogues and the Christian faith that, you know, go to the churches, that they refuse to believe
Right.
in the scientific thought.
No, yeah, you have
So it
Christians
wouldn't
who
be very much more embodied in human life now than to that.
now more than then, but clear, like almost hardly at all. if you think about all the human beings that are denied access to even just basic education, basic nutrition, those millions and millions or billions of people that have that creative human potential, and it's totally denied.
But we know more about science now
Yeah.
than we did at that time.
Yeah, but as we're discovering more things, all we end up doing is opening more doors of what we need to learn more about. Keep discovering what more we need to know. Yeah.
Did Vernadsky say that for a period of time there's something called the biosphere, then he evolves into the noosphere? Or are they just two separate things? What about?
Well, he's saying that this new state has emerged, that with the development of man, a new state, the noosphere, has emerged. And he does say, again, this is a translation, so you can take it with a grain of salt, but he did say somewhere, right, that it's becoming the noosphere. Anyways, yeah, I think that that's the idea because, and he goes through this in the Biosphere, his book, about how, like the sum total of matter hasn't really changed, yet the biosphere is developing. So it's more in a sense of, okay, so you have the oxygen, you have the carbon, you have the nitrogen, you have all the matter, right? You have the stuff. But what process is using it and organizing it? And that the biosphere is consuming these elements and using it, and then so the noosphere is a similar thing. I mean, we're still using the stuff that's on the earth, like NAWAPA. It's not like we're gonna invent new rocks to drill through or something. We're gonna take what exists and...
So is he saying that the noosphere is equal to the biosphere plus human intelligence applied in a certain way to have certain qualitative properties?
Just a change.
He says that they're distinct phase spaces. They are...
separate spaces, but connected, interconnected.
Right.
Biosphere is connected to the lithosphere. The lithosphere creates that process. Combined makes the noosphere. Because it's a human consciousness that ultimately leads to the creation of the noosphere.
But how do you know that you've reached the noosphere?
That is the question.
Yeah, your question kind of answers itself. How could you even ask that question about the noosphere if you weren't part of the
Already in
noosphere?
it.
I don't think a squirrel, like, what's the meaning of my life?
So the answer is we're in the noosphere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we always have been.
Always have been, but we think we're separate.
We always have them.
Well, humans always have
Yeah,
been.
consciousness, human consciousness.
I guess one way you can say it is there's nothing natural about how human beings survive. Like we don't just rely upon
Hunting for food.
yeah, we don't rely upon what we just consume. We actually produce. We change the environment
Well,
to improve
but
it.
the universe itself does that too. Like, it's constant creation.
That
But human beings
reorganization.
do it willfully, and you recognize the effects of that through the rate of development and the accelerating rate of development. That's a key aspect of the human mind. Like the way it took, I mean, who knows how many
years?
millions of years it took to dig the water, to dig the Grand Canyon. Like human beings with a bulldozer, right, or some dynamite, you
Right.
could just do
Go through
something like
mountains.
that, huh?
Go through mountains.
Yeah.
With the dynamite.
And the notion that human beings being an extension of life itself, or some element of life that's reorganizing its basic biological sphere of existence, or lithosphere. and it has a direct effect, and it keeps getting more and more concentrated. And that's what human consciousness indicates, or what his studies have been indicating.
Yeah, the problem with environmentalists and people that like think they love nature in that way is that they're just not at all scientific in terms like looking at these upward shifts of development. Because what most environmentalists talk about is like a balance of nature, a harmony, right? And
Harmony
a
is not
balance. But that's just never existed. It doesn't exist.
And it never will.
Yeah, there is no like simple balance.
Harmony will, balance will. Because the harmony implies in the elliptical orbits and
Yeah.
in the idea of motion and proportion.
But even
That's
right,
the
even the harmony means change.
Right. That means change, asymmetrical change.
Yeah, the way Kepler, definitely develops that idea. But so what you can discover in these long, these more in geological history, these millions of years, these cycles, when you have one of these extinction periods, what emerges is a more highly advanced, more complex system, biosphere systems in terms of the animal life and the planet life. And Vernadsky takes this up too, that it's planet-wide. This happens around the whole planet, not one
Isolated.
like Darwinian kind of evolutionary change.
Like an allopathic speciation, something like that.
Yeah, and so it just happened in this one species over here in one
No.
part of the world, and it had to do with its mating capabilities or something. But around the whole planet, you would just have the manifestation of certain things like feathers or skeletal systems in various seemingly unrelated species, all kind of at the same time. You just have these transformations.
And it's even greater than the planet, because it's implied through these cycles, in 62 million year cycles, that it's a wave that affects the whole region of space.
So you have a constant upshift. So it's seemingly cyclical, but it's actually not. It's more of a
It's like a arc.
increase. Yeah. So in that sense, when you have the emergence of man, especially at this point in time, with the level of scientific and creative capability that is just sitting there as a potential, it's just not unnatural at all. It's not an unnatural interference with nature or with the biosphere. NAWAPA is just what the
Has to be
biosphere
done.
is asking for, what the universe is asking for, mankind to help with the accelerating rate of development.